Hello, it's episode 3 time. Sorry I didn't go out yesterday. I've been sick all day yesterday and sick today, but hopefully we have 2 videos coming out today to make up for it. If not, we'll make it up for it sometime. I don't know. So, I guess yesterday now, I watched The Laundromat. It is a new-ish Netflix movie. So, The Laundromat is directed by Steven Soderbergh and written by Scott Z. Burns. It is also based off of a book written by Jake Bernstein. So, The Laundromat is about the massive data leak about the Panama Papers. Basically, a lot of wealthy people were hiding their money within shell corporations and things like that in different countries. Focusing on that to begin with, it was very informative. I had a rough idea of what the whole Panama Papers thing was, but this movie does a really good job of really going into it in depth, explaining it and explaining why it's so complicated and why it's not this open and shut thing that a lot of people assume it is. So yeah, this movie does a really good job explaining a really complicated thing in a really easy way to understand. Think The Big Short, if you've seen that, how they broke all that down, very similar to how they went about breaking down the Panama Papers in this movie. One such approach they took actually in terms of explaining everything is they actually had Gary Oldman and Antonio Banderas' characters. They did have, quote-unquote normal acting scenes where they're interacting with other characters, but the majority of their appearances were actually fourth wall breaking. They would show up and almost in a sort of poetic way of retelling it, they would break things down into very easy to understand, explain exactly what's going on. And it was also just a very entertaining way of explaining exactly what was happening, a very entertaining way of keeping your audience, in the know. One of the most obvious things this movie has going for it is it has a very deep and impressive cast. I mean, I already mentioned you have Gary Oldman, you have Antonio Banderas, you also had Meryl Streep in there, you had David Schwimmer for about 5 minutes in the movie, you had Jeffrey Wright of Westworld fame, you had Robert Patrick, and then of course you also had a brief appearance from Sharon Stone that was actually pretty good. Obviously Meryl Streep, you know what you're going to get. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if she gets an Oscar nomination for this for no reason other than it's Meryl Streep in a movie. I mean, what more does the Academy need at this point, honestly? Then you had Banderas in a pretty good performance. I really enjoyed him in this movie actually a lot. Jeffrey Wright, David Schwimmer, they both played minor roles, but they were both good. Same with Robert Patrick, he also had a very small role but was good. Gary Oldman, though. So, the first thing I want to mention is Oldman, in terms of delivering his lines, in terms of captivating your attention, he does do a very good job. He is obviously an Oscar winner. Where I take issue with his performance, though, is Oldman in this plays a German, and he has legitimately one of the worst German accents I've ever heard. In fact, I'm pretty sure it changes multiple times throughout the entire movie, and there was one scene where I noticed his accent changed like 5 times within the scene. It was very weird. I've definitely seen some people pointing this out online saying that Oldman's accent is just atrociously terrible, and it really is. It really makes you wonder how he was able to get the role. Sure, it's Gary Oldman, he's a legend. He probably doesn't have to audition for very many things at this point, but you would think that if he's reading something in an accent, they would at least have him do the accent first, right? And make sure he could do a German accent, because he very clearly cannot, and it's pretty distracting throughout the entire movie. There were some other weird things with this movie as well. There was a scene where Jeffrey Wright is sitting down having a meal with his family, and they're talking about different things, his son going to university in America, how Jeffrey Wright, has all this experience and he's wise, blah, blah, blah. And what they were saying during the scene wasn't the problem. That was fine. So the scene starts, you have opposite the camera on the other side of the table, Jeffrey Wright, and then on either ends, left and right side of the frame for the camera, you had his on-screen wife and son, and they were all having a conversation, but throughout the entire scene, the camera kept zooming in on Jeffrey Wright slowly, and it ended, in fact, where you couldn't even see his wife and his son anymore. The problem with this, though, is it served no purpose at all. In fact, when they were zooming in, they would cut off lines from his wife and son, and the whole scene, it felt like they were trying to build to something important. Something important is about to come from Jeffrey Wright's mouth, and then they get right in tight on his face, and they just cut the scene. It was very weird. I really don't understand what the purpose was. That wasn't the only weird scene either. There was a part where Meryl Streep is talking to her on-screen daughter, pretty much explaining things, more so for the audience than anything else, so that the audience could know what was happening. The way they decided to film this scene was Meryl Streep and her on-screen daughter walking through a grocery store shopping. Randomly, Meryl Streep just stops walking. Her daughter keeps going, but Meryl Streep stops and just talks to nobody for a good 10 seconds. Unfortunately, though, that was also not the only weird decision that this movie had. At the very end, and this is a massive spoiler, by the way, which sounds weird for a historical fact movie. At the end, it's revealed that one of the characters, who was a low-level employee in some Panama division of this company, it was revealed that the Panamanian woman in this movie was actually played by Meryl Streep during this big, long monologue scene taken from John Doe's manifesto, the currently anonymous leaker of the Panama Papers. It starts off, the Panamanian woman starts reading, and it says on screen, everything you're about to hear is from John Doe's manifesto. Great. And then, like a third of the way through, she takes off her glasses and then her wig, and it's revealed to be Meryl Streep. And it's Meryl Streep in her other character's clothes. And then that character starts talking from the manifesto for a while, and then Meryl Streep takes off that costume, and it just becomes Meryl Streep. The whole scene was very clearly meant to wrap everything up, right? It was John Doe's manifesto. Meryl Streep is talking verbatim what he wrote. But what was the point of having Meryl Streep play two roles in this movie just for that one reveal? It was very weird. I did research a little bit to try and figure out if he said anything, and he has. Soderbergh said that his explanation for this was he was trying to show that even though this was a movie, at the end of it, when it's actually, John Doe talking, according to Soderbergh, this is what he said. He was trying to show that the themes of this movie, the lesson of this movie, is not that it's a movie, it's that it's real life. It was very weird. Even knowing his explanation, it just doesn't make sense. There was no purpose for Meryl Streep to be playing this other role. It was a very odd decision. But despite all that, I do have to say I did actually really enjoy this movie. It did have its flaws. It did have some very weird places. It did have Gary Oldman with a very terrible German accent, but you also had Meryl Streep doing Meryl Streep things. The writing was spotty in sections. The direction was spotty in sections, but overall, it was still a fun movie to watch. I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. It did definitely have its flaws. The flaws were very obvious, but the flaws weren't enough to not make me like the movie. And so, yeah, 6.5 out of 10. Don't expect too many Oscars for this. Nothing really crazy about it. Of course, Meryl Streep was in it, though, so never be surprised if Meryl Streep gets an Oscar. Just never.
How did I end up here?